Well, we're going to get into some moments of flow here, yeah?
Yeah, man. Why not? Why not? This episode, I pulled a clip from David Lynch, who is a dope filmmaker. He's like most known. There was a show called Twin Peaks. I don't know. It was like 90s or 80s or maybe even, I don't know. It was around that time. It's just like, it's at a new tone kind of like filmmaking is very like surrealist, kind of breaks out of the norm of like storytelling that has been on TV and movies before that. But
nice.
Recently I've come to know a lot of his like behind the scenes interviews, and he talks a lot about creativity, like a lot of meditation. He has some very interesting videos on transcendental meditation I recommend diving into if you're interested at all.
Nice.
So I got one today that I really dig. It's him answering a question, and basically he talks a little bit about how negativity can poison creativity in a way.
I love it. Hell yeah. Let's get into this. David Lynch, Moments of Flow.
You have said that suffering affects creativity in a negative way. How could you explain that artists like Van Gogh and Artaud, for example, have produced such great works of art having suffered so much? If they had meditated, would that unbalance the genius of their work?
This is a very beautiful, important question. And this is part of the myth, I think. Van Gogh did suffer. He suffered a lot. But I think he didn't suffer while he was painting. He went out to paint because he loved to paint. And it might have been one of the happiest, only happy times in his life when he was painting. It was so thrilling for him to be painting. But he didn't need to be suffering to do those great paintings. And I know Van Gogh would have been happier if he'd been able to transcend, dive within. And I know his work would have been as good, better, or even better than good. It stands to reason. The more you suffer, the less you want to create. If you're truly depressed, they say you can't even get out of bed, let alone create. If you're truly angry, occupies the whole brain, poisons the artist, poisons the environment, little room for creativity. And I use this example. If you have a splitting headache, and you have nausea, you're vomiting, and you have diarrhea on top of that, how much work are you going to be doing, and how much are you going to enjoy it? Give the person a technique to lift that sickness, lift that negativity, and enjoy life.
Yes, indeed. Round of applause, round of applause. Air horns. No, that's fire. That's fire. Shout out to David Lynch, whose work, by the way, I am not familiar with, but that was interesting. I got to check out Twin Peaks, you said, right?
Yeah, he's got that one, and another big one's like called Mulholland Drive. That's a big movie that he did.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I got to get hip, but I love what he had to share here. And yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. And I really agree with what he's saying here. And there is that whole stereotype of like some of the best art, it seems, has come from people who were incredibly troubled. And that does lead people to wonder if, well, maybe it's the trouble that the artists have to endure, whether it's external, problems that are being pushed onto their lives, or just like the internal turmoil of depression, anxiety, whatever else is causing them pain, is necessary for them to create these great works. It's not hard to assume that that's the case, to assume that there's not just correlation, but also causation there, right? Where like the pain of the artist led to the great work. And I think maybe there is something to the fact that if you have experienced some deep pain in your life, that it probably gives you a unique perspective, and it certainly gives you material, right? Like it might give you something to speak to in your art that might be very human, because we all suffer and we all experience pain in different ways. It's inevitable. It's just part of being alive. And so it connects us in a way, right? We are in a sense connected through our pain and suffering. And so I do think that, being able to speak poignantly about pain and suffering is one way to connect really deeply with an audience. But I completely agree with what he's saying here, that if you are currently in the pain and suffering, like in the realest way, you're probably not creating much at all. And you're probably not creating to the best of your ability. And the way that he depicted it is actually really brilliant to make us feel this sort of like flu or like the worst imaginable hangover, throwing up, on the toilet, blah, blah, blah. Like just feeling disgusting. Like, of course you're not working. And side note, one of the main things that motivated me when I decided I was going to take a break from drinking alcohol was I just hated being hungover so much. And oh yeah, duh, everybody hates being hungover. But the thing that I started to really despise about being hungover was that I could not be creative on the days when I was hungover. Like, no way. And that's why I love the way that he depicts it here, because it sounded to me like a horrible hangover. And I was like, yes, I completely relate. And I had gotten to a point in my creative career where I was like, I want to be creative every single day, whether it's just practicing or whether it's doing a live stream. This was during COVID, this was the beginnings of COVID, which is when I stopped drinking. Or whatever it is, I want to be creative every single day. And I at least need to have the potential to feel good creating every single day. And any day that I'm hungover is just a day that I've said, never mind. Never mind. I just won't be creative today. And I made that decision the night before, and it's that whole thing of like, anytime you get buzzed basically or intoxicated, you're borrowing from the next day, right? And so I was just like, damn, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be able to create every day. And so I completely agree with what he's saying. And I think a lot of times, and I think there are exceptions to this probably too, that somehow there are probably artists that were like kind of in the trenches with their pain that were still somehow able to get beautiful art out of it, So I think it would be interesting to hear about examples of that, and it would be amazing to hear those people's thoughts on what he's sharing here. Just to get sort of the other side of the coin. But I feel for me personally, yeah, like if I'm really struggling internally or externally, if there's a lot of chaos in my world, it's much, much harder to create. And for me, creating is so much about channeling the inner child. It's so much about play. It's so much about this sense of freedom and non-judgment. And it's really hard to access those kinds of positive, uplifting, open mind, open heart kind of feelings when you're struggling and you're in pain. So yeah, I really, really dig this, man.
It is so tricky because the way he explains it too, it really blurs the line between what we're talking about here. He's saying, yeah, like Van Gogh may have been suffering deeply.
Yeah.
But if he was able to physically get up and paint, like it's not him diving deeper into the suffering per se at that moment, because like that might be the only time he's feeling free and like happy and at peace.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, you might get like Kurt Cobain in like a studio when his life is kind of maybe, coming apart in places, but
right.
Maybe that booth is the solace and it is like the escape. So it's like you're really blurring. You're taking all that pain to create honesty in the booth, but also like you're not necessarily sitting in the pain at that moment in a way where you came up with those ideas or something.
Yeah. 100%. No, that's so true. Yes. It was like that was the escape from the pain. So wouldn't it be nice if that could just sort of expand to the rest of said artist's life, if whatever joy they were able to experience while they were in the studio creating, if only they could experience that first thing in the morning when they woke up, imagine what their life would have been like then. And imagine how much more output they might have had. There's no way of knowing, there's no way of proving that, but it certainly makes sense, at least in my mind, that if some of these people who were struggling so much on a day-to-day were able to experience more of the joy they felt while they were creating throughout their lives, that they would be able to create more, and then we would have even more beautiful art from them to enjoy. So I think it's a really good point. And it makes me think a lot about like the jazz musicians too, like in the 50s, like when heroin was such a big thing on the jazz scene, which it sounds crazy now, but it really would, like everybody was doing it basically, that was kind of the vibe in New York in the 50s on the jazz scene, like everybody was shooting up. And a lot of that, legend has it, was because Charlie Parker was doing it, and he was just the GOAT, and everybody was just like, how do I play like him? And so they thought that it was like the drugs, And so a lot of people started doing it, and it's this crazy thing where it was like, that brought so much turmoil, obviously, into people's lives because it's a horrible substance and it destroys lives. And so it brought so much turmoil, but then it was kind of like, it's so addictive that if you don't have it, you can't function as a normal human, and your life is horrendous. It's like David Lynch's depiction of like the vomiting and the diarrhea is like, that's probably what withdrawal feels like, But then as soon as you get it, and if you get it before the gig and then you go on stage, I mean, that's kind of like fast tracking 30 years of transcendental meditation, which is not meant to be an advertisement to do heroin. Do not do it. But why do people do it when they know it's so horrible, Probably because this level of like bliss and I mean, yeah, non-judgment that can occur in just being in the moment is instantaneously achieved. But that's the problem, is that like anything that is too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true, right? And in fact, it is. It comes at a horrible cost. But yeah, I don't know. That's a bit of a tangent, but somehow this clip makes me think about that.
Yeah, it's like highly addictive and everything, but like you said, like it might have been a little bit because like some of the top heads were like Charlie Parker was on it, and like eventually, a lot of times in like genres like in rock and rap, the eras have their different vices, but a lot of times it becomes like romanticized.
Yes.
This like starving artist struggling, like bleeding, like like that life of the chase of the high, like, oh my God, I haven't slept in these many days. It's a mess. Like somehow you, like an artist, a creative, can kind of think that is the wheels turning in a way. But I love, and I had to like come to, I think like I heard Rick Rubin say something about this or something. He agreed with what you said. Like, there's more output. Like he doesn't subscribe to any of that. Like when he's in the studio with a band and they're on that, he's like, I mean, he was asked like, would they have been able to create those projects without, such struggle? Yeah, I mean, their output would have been better. I think their music would have been better.
Yes.
I think that's all bull, like. So.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's what made me jump to that too in my mind, is like, they romanticize the heroin in the 50s and the struggling artist thing in the same way that we romanticize that now. The same thing that he's speaking to, that if you're not suffering, if you're not in pain, how are you going to create meaningful art? And that's all bullshit, It all, like, life would be better if we didn't have to wallow in suffering, right? Of course. And it's easier said than done to get through the things that ail us. It can sometimes be insanely challenging and requires a ton of work, but it's work that's worth attempting to do. It's work that's worth doing, because on the other side of that, there can be more output and more beautiful output, I think. So it's easy to romanticize all the external things, and all the sort of like peripheral things that are not the actual thing. And I think it's just because doing the actual thing of like making the art is hard. It's hard to sit down and actually pour your soul out. That's really hard. And so we're like, well, maybe if I was doing what Lil Wayne's doing, maybe if I was doing what Charlie Parker's doing, maybe if my life was more interesting. What's one way my life could be more interesting? Well, maybe if I was barely making rent and I was constantly, was in an abusive relationship, well, at least I'd have a story to tell, and it's like, that's all bullshit. What matters is the art. What matters is making the thing. And, it's just that thing about finger painting when we're little kids, that's really what we're trying to do. So
the other stuff almost like allows you to ignore and not confront the scary idea of what it is that you're doing. Like I do have to like go in and create something from my own voice. Like
yes,
all the other stuff kind of like it's doing everything but looking right at that.
Exactly. It's all a distraction. Maybe if I had the right outfit, I'd look like an artist. And then if I looked like an artist, maybe I'd feel like an artist. And then if I felt like an artist, maybe I could be an artist. It's like, or you can just wake up today and be an artist. All you have to do is sit down and make some art. It doesn't even have to be good, but you have to make some art. That's how you become an artist. Really dope clip. Shout out to David Lynch, and shout out to you, Sam, for pulling another great moment of flow.